Hey guys, this is Mika here. I wanted to bring you a war meta update. There have been some builds that have kind of risen in popularity over the last week, and then there's some that have fallen off significantly, and I wanted to go over these changes here. So on the up and up in terms of like what builds are getting better, SNS is finding ways to get more popular, I think as both secondary weapons and as primary, not just as a tank, but also in kill squad. It seems just like a really good weapon choice as a whole with the VG change that went through recently, where that got turned into new rend versus old rend. It just kind of allowed SNS to be used as a util setup as well as an offhand for a more variety of builds. But then you get large benefits without much of a consequence for a lot of classes. Warhammer is also on the up and up. SNS and Warhammer both have access to a lot of good AoE debuffs. SNS has that weaken, which really allows people to get a lot tankier. Warhammer has been kind of on the up and up as more of an offensive weapon, which is a little bit different. People have been trying to go for autos with the Warhammer a lot more, especially with the heavy attack, giving kind of a bugged empower state where it will give people 8 seconds of empower versus 4 due to an interaction with Rimglass dot gems, and that just allows people to do a lot more damage with Warhammer, and typically people aren't warding a lot towards that actual strike damage now because they have to ward the slash and thrust, with bows being very popular, spear being fairly popular, and Great Axe Warhammer being used as much as ever. And that itself has opened up builds like Warhammer and particularly the Cannon Ultimate to allow them to nuke clumps more. With those changes, people have been adopting Cannon mostly as a secondary ultimate instead of Detonate because everyone's running Elemental version, so Detonate isn't hitting as hard now. So Warhammer and Cannon have kind of risen up to take that spot. Greatsword has also kind of made a swing back in popularity from what seemed impossible to happen. I still don't understand exactly why it's happening, but from my understanding right now, Greatsword is able to sort of blitzkrieg very, very well, if that makes sense. It's able to bypass fire staffs because it moves so fast through the backline and the light setup that it's able to get on people and kind of take people out before fire staff has a lot of time to react. And as a consequence to that, fire staff has kind of gone down in popularity, and BB has been back on the rise in order to counter the great swords from going that fast. There's a weird kind of trifecto or maybe even quadfecto at the moment where bow counters fire staff, or sorry, no, fire staff counters bow, bow counters greatsword, and greatsword kind of counters fire staff, and BB is somewhere in the middle there, but loses to bow, loses to fire staff, but also counters greatsword. And then those builds as a whole have been in a weird spot where they're kind of being run to counter each other in different circumstances, and kill squads have been trying to figure out ways to breach the other team's backline, kill the most people as possible, and live with the best effectiveness. And Blunderbuss has kind of risen up as one of those builds that can kind of do that very effectively, but it's been mostly the bow show as of late. Bows are just kind of able to counter most builds. The main thing bow lacks is it lacks kind of clump burst DPS that the fire staff and blunderbuss provide. So there's kind of benefits to all the other weapons, but I would say in general fire staff has gotten a little bit weaker or like less popular with the most recent meta shifts, and bow has gotten more popular, and blunderbuss has gotten more popular, and they're being slotted accordingly. We have gone from kind of a slot as many fire staffs as you possibly can meta quickly down to maybe we'll slot 4 to 6 fire staffs, and it's more in line with was kind of run when fire staff was being played before in other patches. Firestorm is also a little bit on the rise. I'd say it's a little bit less on the rise than what it was with the Void Gauntlet, a nerf that came through, but due to the ability for the Cleansing Firestorm to counter fire builds with providing burn damage reduction, or stripping the dots, and empowering your allies and weakening your opponents, it's just like a really all-around solid ultimate, and that's kind of been getting more popular. I'm starting to see it slotted in like kind of 6 to 8 people rather than like a 1 to 2 specialist ult like Bile used to be. I'd also say Bile is getting significantly more popular because it's allowing fire staff players in particular to be able to focus clump, and that pad is no longer pad because people can't out heal the damage that's coming through, and it actually creates a lot of pressure. And it's weird because fire staff's in a spot where it's no longer padding when you go this setup, and it's just constantly outputting so much pressure that people seem to have to move from the fire staff itself, and fire staff is turning into this kind of clump nuking style weapon that it once was, and that was once kind of glorified as being a pad weapon for is now able to put out significant damage with the Bio Ultimate 2 clumps. But if people run the Cannon Ultimate, it's a little bit better for single target, so it's kind of a preference of how you want to do it. Usually people run the single target cannon just because it does more damage. It hits for about 4.5k versus the AoE one hits for a lot less, and I believe the fire damage that is involved with the blast just gets hard countered by elemental aversion. So it doesn't make a lot of sense to run that because elemental aversion is just super popular and super effective versus that. In kind of a neutral state, I'd say Great Axe is kind of surprising to me, but keeping all of the worst spots it once had. Great Axe has not been the build that's been getting cut as of recent. It's been mostly the Void Gauntlet that has been being cut for other specialist builds. Void Gauntlet just does not seem to have the oomph it once had, and you don't really need it to kill clumps anymore just because people are inherently more squishy. So that slot has been taken up by mostly other kill squad builds like Fire Staff or even Spear in some cases, but it's usually a combination of Fire Staff and Blunderbuss that fits in those extra slots that VG players are kind of leaving vacant. Great Axe is still holding on to 2 slots per group typically though, except for on point teams it seems to be a little bit more niche since SNS kind of outshines it there in some regards, but it still has Enfeebling Maelstrom, which is a really, really good way to counter range damage because it eats projectiles and applies a weaken to clump, which can swing fights heavily in your favor. If you're not running Enfeebling Maelstrom right now as a bruiser player, you're kind of trolling, and that's kind of a, I would argue, one of the best perks to have along with thwarting, and most people are still doing the 300 con and not doing 300 strength with Great Axe because that con feels too mandatory for so many of the passives that are involved in that tree. Ice Gauntlet, I'd also say, is neutral, maybe slightly on an upward trend. People are kind of went away from it for a bit and were like, oh, maybe we can run Fire Staff Blunderbuss, we can have the best of both nuking worlds. And now people are realizing that if they do that, Greatswords can kind of run through the entire team, get their value, and they will not be able to be stopped. So people are slotting Ice Gauntlets again in order to get the showers off to prevent Greatswords from going anywhere and just shutting them down completely. So Greatsword was a soft counter to what that other patch was, but with Ice Gauntlet it seems to solve a lot of the problems that people once had. Rapier is also kind of in a neutral state where it was not as strong as it once was, but it's not really a better option to replace it, so it's staying around. Spear, I don't think it's taken off as much as I would have originally thought, but for where it is getting played, it is keeping those slots and is still slotted as a kind of a niche 3 to 4 man slot build. Originally, I think I thought this would be like you slot 8 to 10 spears, but Blunderbuss, Fire Staff, and just in general nuking builds have outclassed Spear just to Spear being able to live but needing a constant pocket in order to live, and that just tends to be too resource intensive for a group that has 2 Great Axe Warhammers already. I think if we were to go in a spot where we're cutting Great Axe Warhammers, Spear would get more popular, but due to Great Axe Warhammers already being heal intensive, there's not really a spot for here for a Spear because it is just too little resources to go around. Blunderbuss is also in a neutral spot. It's starting to take up a little bit more spots, but it's getting cut from some of the slots as well. Like Firestaff Blunderbuss players are typically going to Firestaff Ice Gauntlet or Blunderbuss Ice Gauntlet now, just because the Ice Gauntlet shower is just too good of util to really pass up. On the downward trend, I would say Fire Staff is becoming less and less popular just due to its inability to stop really fast pushes. It's really good at doing consistent damage over time, and it's just really good at blowing people up, but it doesn't seem as popular with how much elemental aversion is being run to do what it does in OPR, in which that's just basically 1v-Xing. It can't really do that in a war setting. It still doesn't seem bad. It still is really good and it's like better than most builds, but it's just not as powerful due to how people have adapted to Fire Staff being overtuned and slotting basically as much elemental aversion to counter both Fire Staff and Detonate pushes, which is why Detonate is also kind of on a downward trend. Void Gauntlet, as I've spoken about earlier too, is also on the downward trend with the new changes. It didn't actually affect the Void Gauntlet damage that much from the Ren perspective because they increased the Ren overall. It's mostly just a change or a nerf versus light players, but it is a nerf overall and was not a buff versus any single class, except for arguably heavy SNS, but it's like a very, very minor buff. I would consider it to be a neutral change. Void Gauntlet as a whole doesn't feel super strong right now with the changes to cleansing or to refreshing harvest, which is now cleansing harvest, that has kind of pushed Void Gauntlet down in terms of the amount of util it's able to put out, and people have gone to
trying to find some weird trees and weird ways to get value out of the Void Gauntlet that they weren't able to do before. But in general, it doesn't seem needed to lock down people or get the kills anymore, and as accordingly, it's being slotted less because it's not as mandatory. Life staff, I would also say, is kind of on a downward end just because of the Fortify changes. I think this is mostly a PvP mechanic that is being misrepresented, where people are thinking that they could use that Fortify that was once there to really make it so that dungeons are easy, and from a PvP perspective, that you can just kind of exist in a sacred and not have to worry about anything. And with the Fortify changes that have come about, I think more and more people are starting to realize how much of a bad spot the life staff is in. It is outclassed by invigorated a little bit with some niche circumstances in terms of like where you actually run your gear. Like I believe the fortified sacred ground can slightly be outclassed by invigorated, but it's basically net neutral. I would not really worry about that as much as a whole. Just know that you shouldn't really be worried about like, or shouldn't be prioritizing stacking fortify if you're a life staff player, in my opinion. And it's mostly about just outputting as much health per second as you possibly can, because that's what people need to survive now. And the fortify isn't really a cheat code anymore to help people survive. If you want a cheat code to help people survive, SNS is your short-term answer, and then your other answer is weaken. And the best builds that apply weaken are, funny enough, SNS and Great Axe, so those are two that can kind of be slotted, and Great Sword's also decent at applying weaken, as well as some of the ultimates that are still being used apply a good amount of weaken. I'd say in terms of strategy, what has changed? Blitzkrieg has been a very popular strategy in order to gain oppo control. For those of you who don't know your history, Blitzkrieg is basically just a strategy where you just run through people, not really worry about the space that you're taking, just push past them, and then kind of have other people mop up what's behind. So your tanks, as like were used in the Blitzkrieg stats or strat originally, are mostly your great swords, and then you follow that up with fire staff and bows, just quickly taking space, and then basically there's not really an easy way to survive that, and people tend to send those heavily on oppo control and just control that side, so there's not really an easy spot for healers to stand, and as accordingly people have adjusted to making B the typical last hold, because it's harder to do that strategy on B and get value, since those people that are doing that will be caught in open space and are very easy targets for the friendly or the defender team's deck squad. Offensive siege, I'd say, is also something that's being utilized more just because it does significantly more damage. With cannons themselves, they hit for about 9k per hit on the siege, and is a really good way to get siege down quickly, especially if you are a lower damage oriented build. Also, stuff like fire mortars are hitting for 800 a tick now, which is about twice as much as they used to be, it feels like, and it just feels significant enough to warrant using to a degree. It is a really good way to use your repair parts if you have too many cleanse pots to really get a find use out of. Fire traps are also very popular in terms of on defense. Kegs used to be the thing that people go to, but they're just kind of inconsistent to time with people pushing through the doors. So fire traps have been kind of a temporary solution that people have put on the stairs to just prevent people from getting up top for free, and it kind of stops those big pushes and those big breaches. And then I'd say the other big thing is fire staff, bows, and blunderbuss have kind of formed into clump nuker oriented builds. Bows is probably the weakest of this list at that, but they're typically, those kill squad builds are also functioning as nuker builds for clumps now, and Great Axe Warhammer has fallen off a bit in terms of how it nukes. The detonate itself is still powerful, but detonate versus an SNS and with LA version seems to be hitting consistently about 1.3 to 1.5k, which is just not significant enough damage to really warrant those giant detonate pushes where you just all in and try to hope that people die. It doesn't seem consistent enough for it to get value as much anymore, and people haven't figured out a way to swap off of that other than having bows, fire staff, and BBs also assist when those big detonate pushes come through, and try to nuke one particular spot at the point. It hasn't proven super effective as of yet, but that's what people are trying, and that's where the meta has unfolded, and I will see you guys in the next video.